The question came at me across the dim hallway, casual but pointed, and I felt my rehearsed answer dissolve before it reached my mouth. My sister's voice carried that familiar confidence, the kind that assumed agreement before hearing a response, and something in me finally refused to supply one. I stood there holding the stack of folded blankets I had brought from the guest room, and I understood with sudden clarity that my silence had never been protecting them at all. The house belonged to my grandmother, though she had been gone for 3 years now. We gathered there twice a year to manage what remained, sorting through rooms that held more memory than function. It was November, the sky already dark by 5 o'clock, and the heating system rattled through the walls with its familiar, uneven rhythm. I am Claire, and I drove 4 hours to be here on time. My sister had arrived the day before, and my father earlier that morning. They were already deep into decisions when I walked through the front door. My coat still damp from the rain outside. No one greeted me immediately. They were standing in the living room, surrounded by boxes and papers spread across the coffee table. My sister held a folder, reading something aloud while my father nodded. I set my overnight bag down quietly and waited for a pause that never quite came. When my sister finally looked up, she smiled briefly and returned to her point. My father glanced at me, acknowledging without interruption. I moved to the side of the room and listened, tracking the conversation they had clearly been building for hours. They were discussing which items to keep, which to donate, and how to divide responsibilities for the final clearing of the house. The tone was efficient, almost businesslike, shaped by people who had already aligned their thinking before I arrived. I said nothing at first. I had learned over the years that inserting myself into a conversation already in motion often felt like an interruption rather than a contribution. Silence had become my way of honoring the flow, of not disrupting what seemed already decided. My sister moved from room to room, listing tasks and timelines. She had always been the organizer, the one who transformed sentiment into action. My father followed her lead, trusting her structure. I trailed behind them, observing, occasionally offering a nod when something was directed my way. We worked through the evening in stages. Boxes were filled, labels were written, furniture was marked for pickup. The house emptied incrementally, its rooms becoming less familiar with each decision. At one point, my sister handed me a stack of blankets from the hall closet. She gestured toward the guest room where I would be sleeping and asked me to sort through them, keeping what was still usable. The request was simple, matter of fact. I took the blankets without question and carried them down the hallway. The guest room was cold, the radiator silent. I set the blankets on the bed and began unfolding them one by one, checking for stains or wear. The task was meditative, requiring attention without thought. I found myself moving slowly, grateful for the solitude. Through the wall, I could hear my sister and father continuing their discussion. Their voices were steady, punctuated occasionally by the sound of something heavy being moved. I wondered briefly if they had noticed my absence, then dismissed the thought. They were managing fine without me. That realization landed without sting, just clarity. I had spent so many gatherings like this one waiting to be needed, offering help before it was requested, filling silences with usefulness. I had believed that my presence mattered most when it was functional, when it required no adjustment from anyone else. Sitting on the edge of the guest bed, I noticed how automatic that pattern had become. I did not resent it, but I saw it clearly for the first time. My silence had shaped itself around their momentum, not because they demanded it, but because I had offered it so willingly. Later, we gathered in the kitchen for a simple dinner. My sister had brought groceries, already prepared a meal that required only reheating. She moved through the space with familiarity, directing my father to set the table while she plated the food. I stood near the counter, waiting to be told where I fit. "You can grab the glasses," she said without looking at me. I did. We sat together, eating quietly at first. The conversation that followed was light, touching on work and weather, and small updates. My sister spoke most, filling the space with plans for the next day. My father added details when prompted. I listened, my fork moving steadily between bites. At some point, my sister mentioned a decision about the house that I had not heard discussed. She referenced it casually, as if it were common knowledge. I paused mid-bite, uncertain if I had missed something earlier or if the decision had been made before I arrived. "When was that decided?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She looked at me briefly, surprised by the question. "We talked about it this morning. I thought Dad told you." My father glanced up, then back at his plate. "I meant to mention it," he said. It made sense to move forward. I nodded slowly, absorbing the explanation. There was no malice in their oversight, Only the assumption that I would understand, that I would adjust. That assumption had been reinforced so many times that it no longer required confirmation. I set my fork down carefully and took a sip of water. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was noticeable. I felt them waiting for me to smooth it over, to reassure them that everything was fine. I did not. Instead, I held the pause, allowing it to exist without filling it. My sister shifted slightly in her chair. My father cleared his throat. The moment stretched, and I let it. I would have liked to be part of that conversation, I said finally. It affects all of us. The words were calm, not accusatory. Still, they landed with weight. My sister opened her mouth, then closed it. My father nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "You're right," he said quietly. "We should have waited." The acknowledgement surprised me, not because it was insincere, but because it came so easily. I had expected resistance, or dismissal, or the kind of gentle redirection that reframed my concern as unnecessary. Instead, there was simply agreement. We finished the meal without tension, but something had shifted. The conversation that followed was slower, more deliberate. When plans for the next day were discussed, my sister paused and asked for my input. My father waited for my response before moving forward. These were small adjustments, barely perceptible, but I felt them clearly. Later that evening, I returned to the guest room and sat in the dim light from the bedside lamp. The house was quiet now. My sister and father settled into their own spaces. I thought about the moment in the kitchen, about how easily silence had once been my way of keeping peace. I saw now that the peace I had been protecting was not my own, it was theirs. My silence had allowed them to move forward without pausing, to make decisions without checking in, to shape the family dynamic without friction. I had believed I was being considerate, but I had also been erasing myself. That understanding settled into me without drama, but it stayed. I lay back on the bed, the blankets I had sorted earlier folded neatly at the foot. The radiator finally kicked on, filling the room with a low, steady hum. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel the weight of what I had discovered. My silence had never been neutral. It had been a choice, one I had made so often that it became invisible even to me. And now that I saw it clearly, I could not see it. Morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of November light that never fully brightened. I woke to the sound of my sister moving through the hallway, her footsteps purposeful and quick. The house felt different in daylight, less like a memory and more like a task waiting to be completed. I dressed slowly, taking my time before joining them. There was no urgency pulling me forward, no automatic instinct to rush and make myself available. I noticed the absence of that pressure and let myself sit with it. When I finally entered the kitchen, my father was at the table with his coffee, reading something on his phone. My sister stood at the counter, organizing papers into neat stacks. She glanced up when I walked in. "Good morning," she said. "There's coffee if you want it." I poured myself a cup and sat across from my father. He looked up briefly, nodded, and returned to his screen. The silence between us was companionable, requiring nothing. My sister joined us a moment later, setting her papers aside. She began outlining the day's plan, her voice clear and organized. There were specific rooms to tackle, items to appraise, and decisions to finalize. She spoke as though the structure was already agreed upon, her words inviting confirmation rather than input. I listened without nodding automatically. When she finished, I took a sip of my coffee and set the cup down gently. "I think we should go through the attic together," I said. "There are things up there that all of us should see before deciding what happens to them." My sister paused, her expression shifting slightly. "I was planning to handle the attic this afternoon while you two worked on the basement." "I know," I replied, "but I'd like to be part of it." The statement was simple, but it carried a different weight than my usual responses. My father looked between us, waiting to see how the moment would resolve. My sister considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right," she said, "we can do it together." The adjustment was small, but it registered. I felt the shift, not just in the plan, but in how my words had landed. I had not asked permission. I had stated a preference. We spent the morning working through the main floor, sorting items into categories. The rhythm was steady, punctuated by brief exchanges about where things should go. My sister directed most of the work, but she paused more often now, checking in before moving forward. At one point, she held up a set of dishes that had belonged to our grandmother. "These should probably be donated," she said. "They're chipped, and no one uses this pattern anymore." I stepped closer, examining the plates. I remembered them from childhood, Sunday dinners where these dishes had felt special, even if they were imperfect. "I'd like to keep them," I said. My sister hesitated. You're sure? They're not in great condition. I'm sure. She handed them to me without further comment. I wrapped them carefully in newspaper and set them aside. My father watched the exchange quietly, his expression unreadable. As we moved into the afternoon, the attic became our focus. The pool downstairs creaked under our weight, and the air above was thick with dust and stillness. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, labeled in my grandmother's careful handwriting. We worked slowly, opening containers and sorting through contents. Some items sparked immediate memories, others felt unfamiliar, relics from a life we had not fully known. My sister handled most of the sorting, creating piles with practiced efficiency. I found a box near the back filled with old photographs. I sat on the floor and began looking through them, recognizing faces and places I had not thought about in years. My sister glanced over occasionally but did not interrupt. One photograph caught my attention. It showed my grandmother standing with her two daughters, my mother, and my aunt. They were young, maybe in their 20s, standing in front of this same house. My grandmother's expression was calm but distant, her hands folded neatly in front of her. I studied the image for a long time, noticing something I had never considered before. My grandmother looked composed, present, but not quite there. It reminded me of how I often felt in family gatherings, visible but not centered. Did you ever notice how quiet Grandma was? I asked. Holding up the photo, my sister stopped what she was doing and looked at the image. She was always like that, she said. Steady, reliable. She was also overlooked, I said softly. A lot. My father climbed up into the attic at that moment, catching the end of the conversation. He took the photograph from my hand and studied it carefully. Your grandmother kept the peace, he said after a moment. She made things easier for everyone. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger but recognition. At what cost? I asked. He did not answer immediately. He set the photograph down gently and returned to sorting through another box. My sister watched him, then looked at me. What are you saying, Claire? I met her gaze evenly. I'm saying that keeping the peace doesn't mean you have to disappear. The words hung in the dusty air between us. My sister blinked, processing. My father remained silent, his back turned as he continued working. No one argued. No one dismissed what I had said. The moment simply existed, acknowledged without resolution. We continued sorting through the attic. But the atmosphere had shifted. My sister asked more questions. My father paused before making assumptions. I spoke when I had something to say and stayed quiet when I did not. By late afternoon, we had worked through most of the space. Boxes were labeled for storage, donation, or disposal. The attic felt lighter, more intentional. As we climbed back down, my sister stopped on the stairs and turned to face me. I didn't realize I was doing that, she said quietly. Making decisions without you. I nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without needing to expand on it. I know, I replied. I didn't realize I was letting you. She smiled faintly, and we descended the rest of the way in silence. That evening, we sat together in the living room. The house felt different now, less crowded with unspoken expectations. My father built a small fire in the fireplace, and we watched the flames flicker without needing conversation to fill the space. At one point, my sister asked what I wanted to do with my grandmother's old sewing table. I took a moment to consider before answering. I'd like to take it, I said. It reminds me of her. Then it's yours, she replied. The ease of the exchange stayed with me. There had been no negotiation, no need to justify my choice. My preference had been enough. Later, lying in the guest room again, I thought about the photograph from the attic. I thought about my grandmother's quiet presence and how easily it had been absorbed into the family's rhythm. I thought about how silence could become so habitual that it felt like identity. And I understood that what I had been protecting all these years was not connection, it was comfort. Theirs, not mine. That night, as the house settled into stillness, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not disappear to make things easier, not anymore. The next morning unfolded with a different rhythm. My sister woke early, as she always did, but this time she waited before starting the day's work. When I entered the kitchen, she was sitting at the table with her coffee, her papers untouched beside her. I thought we could talk through today's plan together, she said when she saw me. Before we start, I poured my coffee and sat down across from her. My father joined us a few minutes later, and the three of us reviewed what remained. Decisions were made collectively, with pauses for input. When my sister suggested an approach, she looked at both of us before moving forward. It felt deliberate, almost careful, but not forced. We spent the day working through the remaining rooms. The basement was musty and cluttered, filled with boxes that had been untouched for decades. We moved through them methodically, uncovering old tools, holiday decorations, and forgotten household items. At one point, my father pulled out a wooden chest I recognized from childhood. It had been kept in my grandmother's bedroom, used for storing blankets and linens. He opened it carefully, revealing layers of fabric folded precisely. Beneath the blankets, we found letters, dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbon. My father lifted the bundle gently, his expression shifting as he recognized my grandmother's handwriting on the envelopes. "These are addressed to her sister," he said quietly. I didn't know she kept copies. My sister took one of the letters and unfolded it carefully. She read silently for a moment, then looked up at me. "She writes a lot about feeling unheard," my sister said softly, "about always being the one who adjusted." I felt the words settle over me like a weight I had been carrying without naming it. My father took the letter from my sister and read it himself, his face tightening as he absorbed the words. "I never knew she felt that way," he said. "She probably never said it out loud," I replied. We sat together in the dim basement light. The letters spread between us. My grandmother's voice came through in careful script, measured and restrained even on the page. She wrote about family gatherings where her opinions were assumed rather than asked for. She wrote about small moments of invisibility that accumulated over time. She wrote about silence as a form of protection, though she never named who it was protecting. Reading her words, I saw myself reflected clearly. The same patterns, the same quiet accommodations, the same belief that peace required self-erasure. "This is what I've been doing," I said, my voice steady but low. "For years." My sister set down the letter she was holding and looked at me directly. "I didn't see it, Claire." "I should have, but I didn't." My sister set down the letter she was holding and looked at me directly. "I didn't see it, Claire." "I should have, but I didn't." My father nodded slowly. "Neither did I." The acknowledgement did not erase the years of habit, but it created space for something different. I felt a loosening in my chest, not relief exactly, but recognition. "I didn't see it either," I said. "Not until this weekend." We returned the letters to the chest carefully, treating them with the respect they deserved. My father carried the chest upstairs, placing it in the living room where we could decide together what to do with it. That afternoon, we worked through the final tasks with a quieter awareness. Conversations were slower, more intentional. When decisions arose, we paused to hear each perspective before moving forward. My sister checked in before assigning tasks. My father asked questions instead of making assumptions. The changes were subtle, but they were present as evening approached. We gathered in the kitchen for our last meal in the house. My sister had picked up food from a nearby restaurant, and we ate together at the table where so many family meals had unfolded over the years. "What do you want to do with the house?" my father asked, looking between us. My sister glanced at me before answering. "What do you think, Claire?" The question surprised me, not because it was insincere, but because it was direct. I took a moment to consider, letting myself feel what was true rather than what seemed easiest. "I think we should sell it," I said. "Keeping it feels like holding on to something that's already gone." My father nodded. "I agree." My sister hesitated, then nodded as well. "All right, we'll move forward with that." The decision settled without conflict. There was sadness in it, but also clarity. We were letting go of the house, but we were also letting go of the patterns it had held. After dinner, we sat together in the living room one last time. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room felt warmer than it had all weekend. My sister leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, "for not listening better." I looked at her, surprised by the directness of the apology. "I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner." My father cleared his throat. "We all played a part in this," he said, "but we can do better." The words were simple, but they carried weight. I felt something shift in the space between us. Not a resolution, but a commitment. As we prepared to leave the next morning, I walked through the house one last time. The rooms were mostly empty now, stripped of the belongings that had once defined them. I stood in the guest room where I had slept, looking at the bare walls and the neatly folded blankets I had sorted days before. I thought about my grandmother and the letters she had written but never sent. I thought about the silence she had carried and how it had shaped her life in ways she might not have fully understood. I thought about how close I had come to following the same path. Standing there, I made a quiet promise. I would honor her memory not by repeating her patterns, but by breaking them. I would speak when I needed to be heard. I would pause when I needed space. I would protect my own peace, not just everyone else's. As I walked out of the house for the last time, I felt the weight of that promise settle into something I could carry. My silence had protected them for long enough. Now it was time to protect myself. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one I had carried to my grandmother's house. This silence felt intentional, chosen rather than defaulted to. I played music softly through the speakers and let the miles pass, without needing to fill them with thought. When I arrived home, my apartment felt smaller than I remembered, but also more mine. I unpacked slowly, setting the chipped dishes I had claimed on the kitchen counter. They looked out of place among my newer things, but I liked them there. They reminded me of something important. Over the following weeks, I noticed the shift extending beyond that weekend. It showed up in small ways, in moments that would have once passed without my attention. A friend called to make plans and suggested a time. That did not work for me. In the past, I would have rearranged my schedule automatically, believing that flexibility was kindness. This time, I said the day did not work and offered an alternative. She agreed, easily, without hesitation. At work, a colleague assumed I would take on an extra project because I had done so before. I listened to the request fully, then said I did not have the capacity. The conversation ended without tension. The project was reassigned. These moments were unremarkable to anyone else, but to me, they were evidence of something changing. My sister called a few weeks after we left the house. She wanted to update me on the sale process and confirm some final details. Her tone was collaborative, checking in rather than directing. When she asked for my opinion, she waited for my full answer before responding. "You seem different," she said near the end of the call. "More present." "I feel more present," I replied. "I like it," she said simply. The comment stayed with me. Not because it required validation, but because it reflected something true. A month later, my family gathered again, this time at my father's house for Thanksgiving. I drove there with a different awareness than I had carried to previous gatherings. I was not rehearsing how to be agreeable. I was not preparing to take up minimal space. I arrived and was greeted warmly. My sister was already there, helping with preparations. My father was setting the table. I joined them naturally, offering help where it felt genuine rather than obligatory. During dinner, conversations unfolded with the same overlapping energy they always had. My sister spoke confidently. My father added his perspective, but this time, when I spoke, the room adjusted to include me. My words were not talked over or dismissed. They were heard. At one point, my sister mentioned a decision about dividing some of my grandmother's remaining belongings. She started to outline a plan, then stopped herself, mid-sentence. "Actually, Claire, what do you think makes sense?" she asked. I shared my thoughts clearly, and the plan shifted to accommodate them. My father nodded in agreement. The decision was made collectively, without friction. Later, as dishes were being cleared, my sister and I stood side by side at the sink. The rhythm was familiar, but the dynamic felt different. "I've been thinking about those letters," she said quietly. "The ones Grandma wrote." "Me too," I replied. "I don't want to end up like that," she said, holding everything in. "Neither do I." She glanced at me, her expression open. "I think we're doing better." I nodded. "We are." The exchange was brief, but it carried significance. We were acknowledging the pattern we had inherited and the choice we were making to move differently. As the evening wound down, I found myself sitting on my father's back porch, much like I had done at my grandmother's house. The air was cold, but the stillness felt grounding. My father joined me after a few minutes, settling into the chair beside me. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," he said. I looked at him, surprised. "Why do you say that?" "Because you're not making the same mistakes she did," he replied. "You're speaking up. You're here, but you're not disappearing." His words settled over me gently. I had not thought about it in those terms, but he was right. I was choosing presence without erasure. "I learned from her," I said, "but I'm not repeating her story." He nodded, and we sat together in comfortable silence. Driving home that night, I thought about the question my sister had asked in the hallway of my grandmother's house, the one that had dissolved my rehearsed answer and forced me to see what I had been protecting. I thought about how silence had felt like safety for so long, how it had seemed like the only way to keep connection intact. I understood now that a true connection required presence, not absence. It required voice, not just compliance. It required me to show up fully, even when it felt uncomfortable. The chipped dishes sat on my counter when I got home. Catching the light from the street lamp outside, I smiled at them, grateful for what they represented. I was no longer protecting anyone's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. I was no longer mistaking silence for peace, and I was no longer disappearing to make space for others. That night, I slept deeply, the kind of rest that comes from alignment rather than exhaustion. I had learned who my silence had been protecting, and I had chosen, finally, to protect myself instead.